The morning of February 19, 1945, on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches, Corporal James Davis of the 3rd Marine Division watched something that contradicted everything Japanese defenders had been told about American flamethrower weapons. A Marine from the 4th Division's Engineer Battalion advanced toward a reinforced concrete pillbox approximately 70 yards from the waterline, carrying what appeared to be twin cylinders strapped to his back. The weapon operator stopped, braced himself against the wind, whipping across the exposed beachhead, and triggered his M2 flamethrower. The stream of ignited fuel arced through the air in a coherent, pressurized jet that reached far beyond what Japanese intelligence assessments had predicted, far beyond what their defensive positions had been designed to withstand. Inside the pillbox, 2nd Lieutenant Toshihiko Ohno and 11 enlisted men had constructed their fighting position according to specifications developed through 3 years of defensive warfare across the Pacific. Their bunker sat positioned to deliver enfilading fire across the invasion beaches, with walls of reinforced concrete 2 feet thick, a roof designed to withstand naval bombardment, and firing ports angled to provide maximum coverage while minimizing exposure to direct fire. Japanese defensive doctrine, refined through bitter experience at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, calculated precise distances for different American weapons: rifles effective to 300 yards, machine guns dangerous to 800 yards. Flamethrowers, according to intelligence reports compiled from previous engagements and technical assessments of captured American equipment, posed threats only at ranges of 20 to 25 yards maximum. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ohno's position had been sighted accordingly, positioned to survive American approaches until enemy infantry closed to within the distances where Japanese defenders could engage effectively with small arms and grenades. The bunker's firing ports faced the expected American advance routes. The concrete walls provided protection against everything except direct hits from large-caliber naval guns or aerial bombs. The position represented sophisticated military engineering, informed by realistic tactical assessment and hard-won combat experience. But the intelligence assessments regarding American flamethrower capabilities contained a critical and soon-to-be fatal error. The stream of burning fuel from the M2 flamethrower reached across a distance exceeding 40 yards, struck the pillbox's primary firing port, and penetrated deep into the fortified position's interior. The pressurized jet of thickened gasoline, ignited by a white phosphorus igniter and propelled by compressed nitrogen at approximately 300 pounds per square inch, did not dissipate or fall short, as Japanese defenders had been assured it would at such distances. The fuel spray filled the confined space within seconds, consuming oxygen, generating temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and creating conditions incompatible with human survival. The concrete walls that provided excellent protection against bullets and shell fragments became a death trap when burning fuel entered the enclosed space. Within moments, the carefully constructed defensive position that had been designed to exact maximum casualties from attacking American forces ceased functioning as an effective fighting position. The Marines advanced past the neutralized bunker and continued inland, their flamethrower teams engaging subsequent defensive positions with the same weapon that Japanese defenders had catastrophically underestimated. This pattern would repeat itself across Iwo Jima's 8 square miles during Place 9, 36 days of fighting, and again on Okinawa 2 months later, as Japanese forces confronted the uncomfortable reality that their intelligence regarding American flamethrower capabilities had been fundamentally and lethally incorrect. Understanding why Japanese defenders positioned their fortifications at distances they believed safe from American flamethrowers requires examining the evolution of Japanese defensive doctrine across the Pacific War and the intelligence gathering processes that informed tactical decisions. By early 1945, Japanese military planners had abandoned the aggressive offensive operations that characterized the war's early years and adopted increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces while accepting that ultimate defeat on individual islands had become inevitable. The shift toward defensive warfare accelerated following devastating Japanese losses at Guadalcanal in early 1943, where aggressive counterattacks against entrenched American positions resulted in catastrophic casualties that Japan's shrinking manpower pool could not sustain. Subsequent operations at Tarawa in November 1943, where American forces suffered over 3,000 casualties, capturing an island of less than 1 square mile, demonstrated that well-prepared defensive positions could exact terrible costs even in defeat. Japanese commanders studied these engagements carefully, analyzing what defensive techniques proved most effective against American combined arms tactics. The doctrine that emerged emphasized fortified positions constructed from reinforced concrete whenever possible, positioned to provide mutually supporting fields of fire, and designed to survive preliminary naval bombardment and aerial attacks that preceded American amphibious assaults. Japanese engineers became increasingly skilled at constructing these defensive works, utilizing the natural terrain to maximum advantage and incorporating lessons learned from previous battles. Bunkers were positioned on reverse slopes to reduce exposure to direct fire from naval guns. Firing ports were carefully angled to minimize vulnerability while maintaining effective fields of fire. Interconnected tunnel systems allowed defenders to shift positions when specific bunkers became untenable. Critical to this defensive planning was accurate intelligence regarding the effective ranges and capabilities of American weapons systems. Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports from combat veterans who had survived previous engagements, examined captured American equipment when opportunities arose, and attempted to deduce weapon specifications from observable effects during combat. These assessments informed defensive position placement, determining how close American forces would need to approach before specific weapons posed serious threats to fortified positions. Flamethrowers represented a particularly concerning threat to Japanese defenders fighting from bunkers and caves. The weapon's psychological impact exceeded its physical destructive capacity in many cases, as the prospect of burning to death in an enclosed space proved deeply terrifying, even to soldiers prepared to fight to the death. Japanese intelligence efforts focused considerable attention on determining the maximum effective range of American flamethrower weapons, as this distance determined how close American infantry would need to approach before defenders faced this particularly horrific threat. The assessments compiled from engagements through late 1944 indicated that American flamethrowers posed minimal danger beyond 20 to 25 yards. This intelligence came from multiple sources and appeared consistently across different theaters and engagements. Defenders at Tarawa reported that American flamethrower teams had to approach very close to bunkers before their weapons could effectively engage defensive positions. Similar reports emerged from Saipan, where Japanese forces observed American flamethrower operators advancing to within extremely close range before firing. The captured American M1 flamethrower, examined by Japanese technical intelligence officers, appeared to confirm these range limitations based on its fuel capacity, tank pressure, and nozzle configuration. This intelligence assessment appeared sufficiently reliable that Japanese defensive planners incorporated it into fortification design specifications. Bunkers and pillboxes were positioned to provide clear fields of fire beginning at ranges exceeding 30 yards, allowing defenders to engage approaching American infantry with rifle and machine gun fire before flamethrower teams could close to what intelligence indicated was their maximum effective range. The firing ports through which Japanese defenders would engage attackers were designed with angles that minimized exposure to weapons effective only at very close ranges. What Japanese intelligence officers failed to detect, and what Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima discovered with fatal consequences, was that American engineers had developed and fielded a substantially improved flamethrower design during 1944 that possessed dramatically increased range compared to earlier models. The evolution from the M1 flamethrower to the M2 represented a significant technological advancement that fundamentally altered the weapon's tactical employment and effectiveness against fortified positions. The M1 flamethrower, which had equipped American forces during operations through mid-1944, utilized a simple pressurization system that relied on carbon dioxide cartridges to expel fuel through the weapon's nozzle. This design produced a relatively short-ranged fuel stream that indeed operated most effectively at distances of 25 yards or less, precisely matching Japanese intelligence assessments. The weapon carried approximately 4 gallons of thickened fuel mixture in 2 cylindrical tanks mounted on the operator's back frame, providing enough fuel for approximately 10 seconds of continuous firing or shorter controlled bursts. While effective at close range against bunkers and fortified positions, the M1's limited range forced operators to expose themselves to heavy defensive fire while approaching within effective engagement distance. American combat experience with the M1 during operations at Saipan and Peleliu revealed these tactical limitations clearly. Flamethrower teams suffered disproportionately high casualties as they advanced across exposed terrain attempting to close within effective range of Japanese defensive positions. Defenders could engage approaching flamethrower operators with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire during their approach, often killing or wounding the flamethrower team before they reached effective firing range. The weapon's limited fuel capacity meant that operators who successfully reached effective range and engaged targets often exhausted their fuel supply quickly, requiring withdrawal for refilling under continued enemy fire. The Chemical Warfare Service, which held responsibility for flamethrower development, recognized these limitations and initiated development of an improved design during 1943. The resulting M2 flamethrower incorporated several critical improvements that dramatically enhanced its combat effectiveness. Most significantly, the new design replaced the carbon dioxide cartridge pressurization system with compressed nitrogen stored in separate cylinders at substantially higher pressure, approximately 300 pounds per square inch compared to the M1's lower operating pressure. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This increased pressure transformed the weapon's performance characteristics fundamentally. The M2 could project its thickened fuel mixture in a coherent, relatively narrow stream that maintained effective range exceeding 40 yards under favorable conditions, nearly double the effective range of the M1 model. The fuel formulation itself underwent refinement, with improved thickening agents creating a mixture that maintained coherence during flight and adhered more effectively to targets upon impact. The ignition system received improvements, enhancing reliability, critical given that misfires left operators exposed and vulnerable while carrying highly flammable fuel. The M2 entered production during mid-1944 and began reaching combat units in the Pacific Theater during late 1944 and early 1945. Initial deployments occurred in relatively small numbers, with the weapon first seeing significant combat use during the Philippines campaign. However, the largest-scale employment of the M2 flamethrower came during the Iwo Jima operation in February 1945, where Marine Corps engineer battalions and specially trained flamethrower teams utilized the weapon extensively against the island's elaborate defensive fortifications. Japanese intelligence networks, already strained by American submarine warfare's disruption of communications between isolated island garrisons and mainland headquarters, failed to detect or report the M2's deployment and improved capabilities. Defenders on Iwo Jima prepared their positions according to defensive doctrine informed by intelligence assessments that had become dangerously obsolete, though they had no way of knowing this critical fact until American Marines landed on their beaches, carrying weapons whose capabilities exceeded Japanese expectations by substantial and tactically decisive margins. The Marines who operated M2 flamethrowers on Iwo Jima represented a specialized component of the assault forces, trained specifically for the dangerous and technically demanding mission of neutralizing fortified Japanese defensive positions. These men underwent extensive preparation that extended well beyond standard infantry training, learning not only the technical operation of their weapons but also the tactics necessary to survive long enough to employ them effectively against prepared enemy fortifications. Flamethrower operators received their initial training at specialized schools operated by the Chemical Warfare Service, where instructors emphasized both the mechanical operation of the M2 system and the tactical employment techniques that combat experience had proven most effective. The training curriculum covered the weapons assembly and disassembly, routine maintenance procedures necessary to ensure reliable operation under combat conditions, immediate action drills for clearing common malfunctions, and fuel mixing procedures for creating the thickened gasoline mixture that provided the weapon's extended range and target adhesion characteristics. The physical demands of operating the M2 proved substantial. The complete system weighed approximately 68 pounds when fully loaded with fuel and pressurized nitrogen, requiring operators to carry this burden across difficult terrain while under enemy fire. The fuel tanks contained approximately 4 gallons of thickened gasoline mixture, while the separate nitrogen cylinders provided the compressed gas necessary to expel fuel at the high pressures that gave the M2 its extended range. Operators learned to manage this weight during movement, maintaining mobility, while avoiding damage to the weapon's components or rupture of the pressurized nitrogen cylinders. Training emphasized the critical importance of teamwork between flamethrower operators and their supporting riflemen. Doctrine called for flamethrower teams to consist of at least 3 men, the operator carrying the M2 system, and 2 armed with standard M1 Garand rifles or Thompson submachine guns who provided security and suppressive fire during approaches to target positions. The supporting riflemen engaged enemy firing ports and observation positions, forcing defenders to take cover while the flamethrower operator maneuvered into effective firing position. This coordination proved essential for survival, as flamethrower operators carrying their bulky weapons and fuel loads could not effectively defend themselves with personal weapons while approaching targets. The tactics taught to flamethrower teams reflected hard-won lessons from previous Pacific campaigns. Operators learned to use terrain features for cover during approaches, minimizing exposure to enemy observation and fire. They practiced identifying optimal firing positions that provided clear lines of sight to target bunker apertures while offering some protection from defensive fire. Training stressed the importance of short, controlled bursts rather than continuous firing, both to conserve limited fuel supplies and to allow operators to adjust their aim between bursts based on target effects. Instructors emphasized the psychological dimensions of flamethrower operations alongside the technical and tactical training. Operating these weapons required unusual courage, as the nature of the system meant that operators carried highly flammable fuel directly on their backs while advancing toward enemy positions. A single enemy bullet penetrating the fuel tanks could have catastrophic consequences, though combat experience suggested this risk was somewhat lower than commonly believed, as the thickened fuel mixture did not ignite easily from small arms fire alone without the presence of the weapon's ignition system. The M2's improved range fundamentally altered tactical employment compared to earlier flamethrower models. With effective range exceeding 40 yards under favorable conditions, operators could engage many defensive positions from distances that provided significantly better protection from enemy small arms fire. This increased standoff distance improved crew survivability substantially, though flamethrower operations remained among the most dangerous infantry missions, even with the M2's improvements. Japanese defenders concentrated intense fire on any identified flamethrower teams, recognizing correctly that these weapons posed severe threats to fortified positions. By the time 4th and 5th Marine Division assault forces loaded aboard ships bound for Iwo Jima in February 1945, their engineer battalions and specially trained flamethrower teams had completed extensive preparation for the mission they would face. Intelligence briefings described Iwo Jima's elaborate defensive fortifications in considerable detail, based on aerial reconnaissance photographs and preliminary naval bombardment observations. Officers expected the operation would require extensive use of flamethrowers and demolitions against reinforced concrete bunkers, fortified caves, and underground tunnel systems that connected defensive positions across the island. The Marines practiced amphibious assault procedures, rehearsed coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting armor, and conducted final equipment checks on their M2 flamethrowers. The weapons had been carefully maintained, fuel tanks inspected for leaks, nitrogen cylinders tested and pressurized to operational levels, and ignition systems verified through test firings. Everything indicated readiness for the assault, though no amount of training could fully prepare men for the reality of combat on Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape. The initial Marine landings on Iwo Jima's southeastern beaches began at 9 o'clock on the morning of February 19, 1945, following 3 days of naval bombardment that American planners hoped would significantly degrade Japanese defensive positions. The reality proved far different from these optimistic expectations. Japanese commanders had constructed their fortifications with such skill and positioned them so effectively that the preliminary bombar, the devastating effectiveness of M2 flamethrowers against Japanese fortifications on Iwo Jima, fundamentally transformed American tactical doctrine for assaulting heavily defended positions during the remaining months of the Pacific War. Marine Corps after-action reports from the island documented in meticulous detail how flamethrower teams had neutralized defensive positions that appeared nearly impervious to other infantry weapons, bunkers whose reinforced concrete walls withstood direct hits from tank guns, and whose firing ports remained active despite intensive preparatory bombardment. Statistical analysis compiled by Marine Corps operations officers revealed the weapon's decisive impact on reducing American casualties during bunker assaults. Positions engaged with flamethrowers typically ceased resistance within minutes, compared to prolonged fighting that could last hours when infantry relied solely on grenades, satchel charges, and small arms fire. The extended range of the M2 model proved particularly significant in this casualty reduction, allowing operators to engage targets from distances that provided substantially better protection from defensive fire compared to earlier flamethrower models. Combat engineers and operations planners immediately began incorporating these lessons into preparations for the anticipated invasion of Okinawa, scheduled to begin barely 6 weeks after Iwo Jima's completion. The Marine divisions and Army units designated for the Okinawa operation received increased allocations of M2 flamethrowers, with some infantry companies equipped with multiple flamethrower teams rather than the single team that had been standard in earlier operations. Training intensity increased for flamethrower operators, with experienced veterans from Iwo Jima sharing tactical insights with newly trained crews. The Okinawa campaign, which commenced on April 1, 1945, presented an even more challenging environment for American forces than Iwo Jima had offered. Japanese defenders on Okinawa had constructed elaborate defensive networks that exploited the island's natural cave systems and limestone ridges, creating fortified positions of extraordinary strength and tactical sophistication. The Shuri Line defensive complex that anchored Japanese resistance incorporated hundreds of interconnected caves, tunnels, and reinforced bunkers that proved exceptionally difficult to reduce through conventional weapons. Flamethrower teams played critical roles throughout the Okinawa campaign, which lasted 82 days and resulted in over 49,000 American casualties. The M2's extended range allowed operators to engage cave mouths and bunker apertures from positions, offering some protection, though the missions remained extraordinarily dangerous. Japanese defenders understood clearly by this point in the war that American flamethrower teams represented priority targets, deserving concentrated fire, having learned through bitter experience on Iwo Jima and previous campaigns exactly how destructive these weapons proved against fortified positions. Tank-mounted flamethrowers, developed in parallel with portable infantry systems, also saw extensive employment on Okinawa. These armored flamethrower tanks combined the M2's flame projection capabilities with armor protection that significantly improved crew survivability compared to infantry operators carrying portable systems. The tanks could approach heavily defended positions while protected from small arms fire, engage bunkers and caves with their flame projectors, then withdraw while continuing to suppress enemy positions with mounted machine guns. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese tactical responses to American flamethrower employment evolved as the campaign progressed. Defenders attempted to engage flamethrower teams at maximum range, concentrating rifle and machine gun fire on any identified operators before they could close within effective engagement distance. Some positions incorporated water tanks that defenders could rupture to flood bunker interiors with water, theoretically providing some protection against flame attacks, though the effectiveness of this measure remained questionable given the intensity of temperatures generated by burning thickened fuel. The fundamental problem Japanese defenders faced was that their fortifications, however skillfully designed and constructed, contained inherent vulnerabilities to flame weapons that no amount of concrete thickness or tactical positioning could fully eliminate. Bunkers and caves required firing ports and entrance openings to remain tactically useful, and these necessary openings provided avenues through which pressurized streams of burning fuel could penetrate interior spaces. The enclosed nature of these positions, which provided excellent protection against bullets and shell fragments, became a fatal liability when burning fuel, consuming oxygen, and generating extreme temperatures entered the confined spaces. American production of M2 flamethrowers increased substantially during spring and summer 1945 as military planners prepared for the anticipated invasion of Japan's home islands. Intelligence estimates predicted that Japanese defenders would construct fortifications on Kyushu and Honshu that would dwarf even the elaborate defensive networks encountered on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The planned operations called for massive employment of flamethrower-equipped infantry and armor to reduce these fortifications, with procurement numbers for M2 systems reaching into the thousands of units. Japanese military intelligence officers and tactical planners who survived the war and provided post-war testimony to American interrogators acknowledged that their pre-war and early war assessments of American flamethrower capabilities had proven catastrophically incorrect. This intelligence failure, they admitted, had directly contributed to defensive position designs that proved vulnerable to weapons whose actual capabilities exceeded Japanese estimates by substantial and tactically decisive margins. The specific reasons for this intelligence failure revealed broader problems within Japanese military intelligence gathering and analysis processes during the Pacific War. Geographic isolation of island garrisons meant that combat lessons learned on one island often failed to reach defenders preparing positions on other islands before American forces arrived. Communication between scattered defensive positions and Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo deteriorated progressively as American submarine warfare interdicted Japanese shipping routes and severed the communication links connecting isolated garrisons. Japanese technical intelligence capabilities, never as sophisticated or well-resourced as Allied equivalents, struggled to obtain and analyze captured American equipment under the increasingly desperate circumstances of mid-war defensive campaigns. Opportunities to examine captured American weapons occurred primarily when individual pieces of equipment fell into Japanese hands during combat, circumstances that rarely allowed for thorough technical analysis under controlled conditions. The few American flamethrowers that Japanese forces captured during early Pacific fighting had been M1 models, whose performance characteristics matched Japanese intelligence estimates but provided no warning of the substantially improved M2 design that would follow. Institutional factors within the Japanese military also contributed to the intelligence failure. Information suggesting that American weapons capabilities might exceed official estimates faced skepticism from officers whose careers and reputations depended on maintaining confidence in established defensive doctrines. Reports from frontline units describing unexpectedly long-range American flamethrower attacks were sometimes dismissed as exaggerations resulting from the confusion and stress of combat, or attributed to unusual atmospheric conditions or terrain effects, rather than fundamental improvements in American weapon design. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders who survived encounters with M2 flamethrowers proved profound and demoralizing. Soldiers who had constructed their defensive positions according to specifications they believed would provide protection from American flame weapons discovered through terrifying direct experience that these calculations had been fatally wrong. The realization that carefully prepared fortifications offered inadequate protection undermined confidence in defensive doctrine more broadly and contributed to the severe psychological strain Japanese defenders experienced during the war's final campaigns. Medical officers treating Japanese soldiers evacuated from frontline positions on Okinawa documented severe psychological trauma among survivors of flamethrower attacks. Many exhibited symptoms consistent with what modern psychiatry would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder, including intrusive memories of the attacks, severe anxiety when returning to enclosed spaces, and profound fear responses to sounds or smells associated with burning fuel. The psychological damage extended beyond individuals who had directly experienced flamethrower attacks to affect entire units, whose members understood they might face similar weapons against which their fortifications provided insufficient protection. Japanese defensive tactics evolved in response to the flamethrower threat as the war progressed, though with limited effectiveness given the fundamental advantages American forces possessed. Some defensive positions incorporated multiple interconnected chambers separated by turns and baffles, designed to prevent flame penetration throughout entire tunnel systems. Defenders attempted to maintain secondary positions from which they could engage flamethrower teams, while those operators focused on primary bunker apertures. These adaptations achieved marginal improvements in defensive effectiveness, but could not overcome the basic vulnerability of fortified positions to weapons specifically designed to exploit their inherent weaknesses. The final months of the Pacific War saw Japanese military planners preparing defensive positions on the home islands under the assumption that American invasion forces would employ flamethrowers extensively, using lessons learned during the Okinawa campaign to inform fortification designs. Intelligence estimates predicted that American forces would utilize both portable infantry flamethrowers and armored flamethrowing tanks in massive numbers during any invasion of Japan. Defensive preparations attempted to incorporate countermeasures against these weapons, though the war's end in August 1945 prevented these preparations from being tested in actual combat. Post-war interviews with Japanese officers who had commanded defensive positions on Iwo Jima and Okinawa revealed their recognition that American flamethrower capabilities had significantly exceeded their intelligence estimates. Several officers acknowledged that different defensive position placement, designed with accurate understanding of M2 range capabilities, might have complicated American assaults and potentially increased American casualties, though all recognized that such tactical adjustments could not have altered ultimate strategic outcomes given overwhelming American material advantages across all dimensions of military power. The story of Japanese defenders, discovering through fatal direct experience that American M2 flamethrowers possessed capabilities far exceeding their intelligence estimates, represents more than an isolated tactical intelligence failure. This episode illuminates fundamental dynamics of technological warfare, the critical importance of accurate intelligence in military planning, and the human costs of miscalculation in combat, where errors in judgment or assessment are paid for in lives rather than merely acknowledged as mistakes. The M2 flamethrower itself continued serving in American military inventories well beyond World War II's conclusion. The weapon saw extensive employment during the Korean War, where it proved effective against Chinese and North Korean fortified positions in terrain that resembled Pacific Island fighting in many tactical respects. Modified versions remained in service through the Vietnam War, where American forces used flamethrowers against fortified positions and tunnel complexes, though with increasing controversy regarding the weapon's humanitarian implications and the psychological effects on both targets and operators. The broader evolution of military flamethrower technology reflected continuing tensions between tactical effectiveness and humanitarian concerns. International law developed increasingly restrictive frameworks governing incendiary weapon employment, driven partly by recognition of the particularly horrific nature of burns as combat injuries, and partly by evolving standards regarding acceptable methods of warfare. The United States military eventually phased out portable flamethrowers during the 1970s, though thermobaric weapons and other incendiary systems continued serving specialized roles in subsequent conflicts. For the Marines who operated M2 flamethrowers on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the psychological burden of their missions proved lasting and severe. Post-war interviews and memoirs from flamethrower operators frequently described profound moral and psychological struggles with the nature of their weapons and the manner of death these weapons inflicted. Many expressed relief when their flamethrowers ran out of fuel during combat, as equipment failure provided morally acceptable reasons to cease employment of weapons whose effects troubled them deeply despite recognizing their tactical necessity. The Japanese soldiers who constructed defensive positions based on inaccurate intelligence regarding American flamethrower range paid for these miscalculations with their lives, dying in fortifications they believed would provide protection from weapons whose actual capabilities exceeded their estimates. Their experience demonstrates how intelligence failures in warfare produce consequences measured not merely in tactical setbacks or strategic disappointments, but in human lives lost through preventable errors in assessment and planning. The historical irony remains striking. Japanese military engineering and defensive construction capabilities during the Pacific War's later campaigns represented sophisticated applications of technical knowledge, careful analysis of terrain, and intelligent adaptation of defensive doctrine to challenging circumstances. Japanese defenders constructed fortifications that withstood intensive naval bombardment, resisted assault by conventional infantry weapons, and forced American attackers to pay terrible costs for every yard of contested ground. Yet, these elaborate defensive works incorporated a fundamental and fatal vulnerability born from inaccurate intelligence regarding a specific American weapon system. The morning of February 19, 1945, when that first M2 flamethrower stream arced across Iwo Jima's black sand and penetrated a Japanese pillbox from a distance defenders had believed safe, marked the beginning of brutal education in the costs of intelligence failure. The fortifications scattered across Iwo Jima's volcanic landscape, constructed according to specifications informed by obsolete assessments of American capabilities, became death traps rather than defensive bastions when confronted by weapons whose range exceeded Japanese calculations by margins that proved tactically decisive and personally fatal. The specific technical advancement from M1 to M2 flamethrower models represented the kind of incremental improvement in military technology that occurs continuously during warfare, as combatants seek advantages over their opponents. American engineers had identified limitations in their existing flamethrower design, developed improvements addressing those limitations, and fielded the enhanced system to combat units. Japanese intelligence networks, strained by geographic isolation and communication disruptions, failed to detect this development before it arrived on Pacific battlefields with devastating effect. This pattern of technological evolution exceeding opponent intelligence awareness repeated itself throughout World War II, across multiple weapon systems and combatants. German defenders discovering that Allied tank armor had improved beyond their anti-tank weapon capabilities. Japanese naval officers learning that American radar technology exceeded their estimates. American bomber crews finding German air defenses more lethal than intelligence suggested. The common thread linking these episodes involved the perpetual challenge of maintaining accurate current intelligence regarding opponent capabilities in dynamic wartime environments where technological development proceeded rapidly and security measures restricted information flow. The legacy of the M2 flamethrower in Pacific War combat extends beyond its tactical effectiveness against fortifications to encompass questions about intelligence processes, technological development cycles, and the human dimensions of warfare where miscalculations and misassessments extract their costs from individual soldiers facing weapons they inadequately understood. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima who died in bunkers they believed would protect them from American flamethrowers serve as permanent reminders that in warfare, intelligence failures kill, and the gaps between estimated capabilities and actual capabilities are measured ultimately not in yards of flame projection distance, but in lives lost to inadequate preparation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.